The U.S. has launched self-defense strikes. That is what they're saying. Washington Post with this breaking headline saying U.S. forces launching a new round of military strikes on Iran in response to attacks on American warships.
The radar operator almost logged it as a ghost return. 3 seconds of contact. A faint smear across the display, barely distinguishable from sea clutter. Then nothing. He flagged it anyway, mostly out of habit. That small decision, made by a junior petty officer on a routine watch, would be the first domino in what became one of the most compressed and violent naval engagements the Strait of Hormuz had ever seen. It was not supposed to happen tonight. The USS Mason, along with the Arleigh Burke and the USS Truxtun, had been threading through the strait on a standard freedom of navigation patrol. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers moving in coordinated formation through 21 miles of international water, flanked on both sides by coastline that had never fully decided whether it was hostile or merely waiting. The task force had done this before. They had charts, protocols, rules of engagement, and enough firepower to end most arguments before they started. What they did not have was warning. The smear on the radar returned. This time it multiplied. Within 40 seconds, the tactical displays aboard all 3 ships lit up with contact signatures appearing simultaneously from the northeastern shoreline, from shallow coastal inlets to the north, and from 3 separate offshore vectors converging at the lower edge of the strait. The geometry was deliberate. Whoever had planned this did not want the task force maneuvering. They wanted it pinned. The first wave was not missiles. That was the detail that surprised the analysts most when they reviewed the engagement records afterward. Iran did not open with its heaviest weapons. It opened with noise. Dozens of fast attack craft, the small, low-draft speedboats that the IRGC Navy had spent 20 years refining into a genuine tactical instrument, came off the coast at full throttle. Not in a disorganized rush, but in staggered columns designed to approach from angles that would force the American destroyers to divide their radar coverage. Mixed in with the surface contacts were Shahed series drones flying at wave-top altitude, their radar cross-sections nearly indistinguishable from wave interference at close range. Above the drone layer, relay platforms circled at altitude, invisible to the surface ships, acting as data bridges between the fast attack formations and command centers positioned well inland. What the IRGC had built was not simply a swarm. It was a networked attack. Every element fed information to every other element. The fast boats knew where the destroyers were. The drones adjusted their approach angles in real time based on that data. The relay platforms ensured the signal chain stayed intact even if individual nodes went quiet. The plan was to saturate. To flood the Aegis systems with enough simultaneous threats that the targeting queues backed up, that the crew decision cycles lagged behind the incoming geometry, and that somewhere in the gap between sensor input and weapons release, something got through. It was a serious plan. It had clearly been rehearsed. And for approximately the first 6 minutes, it was working. Aboard the Mason, the Aegis combat system had shifted to full combat mode within seconds of the mass contact alert. The SBY-6 radar, a generational upgrade over the older Spy-1D, capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously with substantially improved discrimination at low altitude, began building a threat picture that was already extraordinary in its complexity. Mark 41 vertical launch cells opened. The first RIM, 162 YSSM rounds were in the air before most of the crew had fully processed what was happening. The extended Sea Sparrow is a purpose-built answer to saturation attacks. Medium range, fast, highly maneuverable, capable of terminal engagement against small and fast-moving targets that would challenge heavier interceptors. The Mason and Truxtun began systematically working through the drone layer, volley by volley, while the 5-inch Mark 45 guns turned their attention to the leading edge of the surface swarm. At 2.5 miles, fragmentation rounds from naval guns are not precision weapons. They are area denial. The rounds detonated above and ahead of the oncoming boats, tearing through fiberglass and outboard engines and the men operating them, scattering the front ranks of the approach before they could find their firing solutions. The Arleigh Burke, rather than adding to the intercept queue, had taken on a different role. The ship's radar was operating in an auxiliary tracking configuration, maintaining a second independent tactical picture that could be cross-referenced with the Mason's primary display. The purpose was redundancy. If the Iranian attack succeeded in degrading one ship's sensor picture through electronic interference or sheer contact volume, the task force would not go blind. It would have a backup set of eyes that had never shared the same vulnerabilities. This was not improvised. This was a doctrine that had been written specifically for this threat. At 4 minutes into the engagement, Iran made its first major adjustment. The Shahed drones that had been approaching at low altitude descended further, from 10 meters above the water to 3. At that height, the boundary between a radar return from a drone and a radar return from wave crests becomes genuinely difficult to resolve, even for a modern phased array system. The IRGC had studied American sensor performance and they understood the sea clutter problem. By forcing the Aegis system to process hundreds of low-altitude contacts against a background of constant electromagnetic interference from the water surface, they were not trying to hide the drones entirely. They were trying to slow the kill chain down, to introduce hesitation, to make the system spend processing cycles on discrimination instead of targeting. Simultaneously, Iran activated its coastal relay network at higher power, flooding the relevant frequencies with increased data throughput to keep the fast boat formations coordinated even as their sensor picture degraded in the electronic environment. It bought them approximately 4 minutes. The EA-18G Growlers had launched from the USS Abraham Lincoln before the engagement even reached its first peak. The carrier was operating well outside the strait, positioned deliberately beyond the reach of Iran's coastal anti-ship missile batteries. But the Lincoln's aircraft were not beyond reach of the fight. The Growlers crossed into the electromagnetic battlespace at low altitude with their ALQ-218 receivers already sweeping the frequency spectrum and their jamming pods charged and ready. What the Growler does is frequently misunderstood, even by people who follow these things closely. The popular version of the story is that it broadcasts powerful interference signals that overwhelm enemy radar. That is true, but incomplete. The more sophisticated capability is what the system does with the radar signals it receives before it ever transmits a single jamming watt. The ALQ-218 captures incoming radar emissions, the pulses that Iranian relay nodes and targeting systems were transmitting to keep the swarm coordinated, and feeds them into a digital radio frequency memory system that processes those pulses in nanoseconds. The DRFM does not simply record what it receives. It manipulates it. It generates return signals that are mathematically consistent with the original pulse but contain altered position, velocity, and altitude data. When those manipulated returns are transmitted back to the emitting system, the Iranian radar operators do not see electronic noise on their screens. They see aircraft, dozens of them, moving in coherent formation, at realistic speeds and altitudes, following flight paths that look completely plausible. The Ghost Fleet. While Iranian air defense operators were working through a sudden appearance of what looked like a major American strike package approaching from the west, the actual Growlers were elsewhere. While Iranian relay platforms were busy trying to reconcile the phantom returns with their surface picture, the data connections between shore-based command and the offshore swarm began to degrade. Not from raw jamming power, but from the far more elegant problem of an enemy that could no longer trust its own sensors. The fast attack formations, deprived of continuous targeting updates from the relay network, began to lose their geometric coherence. Boats that had been executing coordinated angle approaches started diverging. Some accelerated, some slowed, some turned on instinct rather than instruction. The swarm was not destroyed, but it was no longer a networked system. It had become a collection of individual boats making individual decisions in an environment where none of them could be certain what the ships ahead of them were doing. That was when the engagement shifted. The Truxtun, which had been holding its SM-6 inventory for the highest priority threats, received targeting data directly from the F-35CS now operating in the airspace above the strait. The F-35 sensor fusion capability does something that no single platform can replicate alone. It takes input from its own active radar, its passive infrared sensors, its electronic support systems, and the data link feeds from every other platform sharing the network, and synthesizes all of it into a single, coherent tactical picture that is continuously updated. The pilot does not manage individual sensor systems. The aircraft does that. The pilot flies and makes targeting decisions with a picture that is, in most respects, more complete than what any ground-based command center was seeing. The Truxtun's SM-6 launch was not a defensive action. The Standard Missile-6 was not designed purely as an interceptor. In surface attack mode, guided by targeting data from the F-35s, it is a long-range strike weapon capable of engaging surface targets beyond the horizon, targets that the launching ship cannot see and is not tracking independently. The missiles left the vertical launch cells, climbed briefly, then descended toward the Iranian coastal relay infrastructure that had been the backbone of the swarm's coordination. The active radar seekers in the SM-6 warheads did not need the original targeting data to remain valid after launch. They searched for the emitting sources themselves, homing on the radar and communications transmissions that the relay nodes were still generating. When a radar transmits, it announces its own location. The IRGC understood this. They had doctrine about emissions control and radar discipline, but in the middle of a complex coordinated attack, with multiple commanders demanding situational awareness and dozens of fast boats requiring continuous guidance updates, emissions control is extremely difficult to maintain. Systems that are supposed to transmit only in short bursts stay on too long. Nodes that should have gone quiet stay active because someone upstream needs the data. The relay network had been transmitting for 19 minutes. That was long enough. The SM 6 impacts were simultaneous across 3 target coordinates. The relay nodes that had been sustaining the swarm's coherence went offline within a window of 11 seconds. The fast attack formations, already degraded by the Growler's manipulation of their guidance signals, lost their remaining coordination entirely. Without shore-based command feeding targeting updates, without relay platforms maintaining the data bridge, the boats were operating on their original approach vectors and whatever their individual commanders could see from the surface. What they could see was 3 destroyers that had not run. That point deserves attention, because it is not obvious from the outside. The default assumption about a naval force encountering a saturation attack in a confined strait is that the ships should attempt to exit the threat environment, to use their speed to create distance and restore maneuvering room. The commander of the task force made the opposite decision. The 3 destroyers reduced speed and moved into a tight defensive box, trading mobility for weapons density and radar stability. The logic was straightforward, if uncomfortable. Attempting to run through a swarm at high speed while the swarm is still coordinated and networked creates unpredictable geometry. Angles change too fast. The tactical picture for the Aegis systems becomes harder to maintain when the ships themselves are in aggressive maneuvering. By slowing down and concentrating the formation, the task force accepted that some threats would get close. What it got in return was the ability to mass every defensive system in the formation against threats that were now approaching from predictable vectors. The Mark 45 guns worked the surface layer. The SSMs worked the drone layer. As threats penetrated inside 2,000 yards, the phalanx close-in weapon systems came online. The final layer, the one that nobody wants to be using because it means everything else has already fired. Each phalanx carries a 20mm Gatling gun capable of 4,500 rounds per minute. Against a fiberglass boat at 500 yards, the engagement lasts roughly 2 seconds. What remains afterward is not a meaningful threat. The last coherent IRGC assault on the task force dissolved inside that final defensive layer. Not all of it was intercepted cleanly. The post-engagement damage assessments noted minor hull damage on the Truxtun from debris, and the Mason's aft radar array required recalibration after the engagement. But the ships were intact. The formation held. By the time the sun came up, the Strait of Hormuz looked the way it looks every morning, hazy, congested with commercial traffic, indifferent to the events of the previous 2 hours. The commercial shipping lanes were open. The tankers that had been holding position in the Gulf of Oman, waiting to see how the night resolved, began moving again. What remained of the IRGC's offshore capability in the lower strait was in retreat, fragmented, and no longer capable of coordinated action. The coastal relay infrastructure that had taken months to position and calibrate was destroyed. The fast attack formations that had been the centerpiece of the asymmetric strategy were decimated or dispersed. The air defense systems that had attempted to threaten American aircraft had given away their positions to the one weapon system specifically designed to exploit that mistake. The Growler did not win the battle alone. The SBY-6 radar, the SM-6, the SSM, the F-35 sensor fusion, the phalanx, the Aegis architecture, the doctrine that had been refined across decades of thinking about exactly the scenario, all of it contributed. But the invisible hand running through the engagement, the capability that turned a credible saturation attack into a failure before the kinetic battle even reached its peak, was the digital manipulation of the electromagnetic environment. Iran brought a networked swarm. The Growlers made the network a liability. The ghost targets on Iranian radar screens that night were not a side effect. They were the point. Every missile fired at a phantom contact was a missile that could not be fired at a real ship. Every radar operator who spent 60 seconds trying to reconcile contradictory sensor returns was an operator not directing fast boats toward firing solutions. Every command center that went quiet to avoid becoming a target for the SM-6 was a command center no longer controlling the swarm it had launched. The Strait of Hormuz has been called the world's most important 21 miles of water. Roughly 30% of all seaborne oil passes through it. Closing it, even briefly, even partially, sends oil markets into convulsion and creates downstream effects that reach every economy on Earth. The IRGC has understood for decades that the threat to close the strait is one of the most powerful strategic levers Iran possesses. Not the act of closing it, which any serious naval force would contest. The threat. What that night demonstrated was the cost of making the threat operational. The networked swarm doctrine that Iran had invested years developing was not defeated by superior numbers or heavier weapons. It was defeated by a capability that most observers would struggle to describe if asked: the ability to make an enemy's own sensors lie to them, at the moment it matters most, without the enemy knowing it is happening until it is already over. The strait remained open. It always does.